He told her to forget him, and she did. But when the Millionaire CEO saw her again with twin sons who looked just like him, his world shattered. Andrew Collins had always believed that nothing and no one could shake the life he had built. Every decision he made was calculated, every step forward planned with precision, and every weakness was buried under layers of discipline. With brown eyes that could turn a boardroom silent and a reputation for being ruthless yet brilliant, he had risen to the top faster than most men twice his age. He moved through the world in tailored suits, a figure of control and certainty, the kind of man who never second-guessed himself because he believed his instincts were unshakable. Women admired him, rivals feared him, and employees followed him, but behind the confidence and success was a man who saw emotions as threats, love as distraction, and vulnerability as something that could undo years of power in a single moment. When Julia Harper entered his life, she had been the one person he allowed too close. She was different from the polished women who normally circled him, women who saw his wealth and status before his soul. Julia had light brown hair that caught the sunlight in a way that made it glow, and her striking blue eyes were filled with a sincerity that disarmed him. For the first time, Andrew felt the dangerous pull of something he could not control, and though he tried to keep her at a distance, he found himself lowering walls he had built for years. For a time, he almost convinced himself that being with her did not compromise his empire, that perhaps he could have both love and power. But that illusion shattered the night she stood before him, her hands trembling and her voice unsteady as she whispered that she was pregnant. The words fell into the room like an explosion. Julia expected fear, maybe hesitation, but also hoped for relief in the form of love, reassurance, and support. Instead, she watched as Andrew's face hardened, his jaw tightening, his eyes cooling until they became the same unreadable shields she had seen him use in business. He said nothing for a long time, and that silence was worse than anger. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, but it cut through her like a blade. "Forget me," he said. The words were sharp, final, spoken as if he were closing a deal rather than dismantling a life they had begun together. Julia stared at him in disbelief, her heart collapsing under the weight of his rejection. She had come to him vulnerable, willing to share the deepest truth of her life, and instead of being embraced she was cast aside. She wanted to plead, to remind him of the nights they had spent together, the promises he had whispered in rare moments when his guard had slipped, but she saw then that he had already shut the door. His expression was unreadable, his posture rigid, as though he had walled himself off from any possibility of regret. He thought he was protecting himself from chaos, preserving the empire he had worked for, but what he did in that moment was destroy something he would never be able to rebuild with money or control. She left his penthouse that night, her steps unsteady as if the ground itself had turned against her. Outside, the city sparkled with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the storm that raged inside her. She carried nothing with her but the clothes on her back and the knowledge that she was now truly alone. Her tears blurred the streets, her body trembling with both fear and determination. She realized that he had taken from her not just love but also the illusion of safety. What he had not taken, however, was her resolve. She whispered to herself as she walked away that she would not forget him, not yet, but one day she would stop waiting for him. She would build a life without him, and when he looked back, if he ever did, he would find nothing but the shadow of what he had thrown away. Inside his penthouse, Andrew stood by the window long after she had gone, staring at the city lights as though they could justify his choice. He repeated the words "forget me" in his head like a mantra, convincing himself it was the right decision, that by cutting her out he was preventing weakness, protecting himself from scandal, and keeping control. Yet deep inside, where he refused to look, something twisted and hollow opened. He did not admit it then, but in choosing pride over love, he had sentenced himself to years of emptiness. He thought she would never truly forget him, that no one could walk away from Andrew Collins, but he had no idea that those words would one day come back to haunt him in a way he could never have imagined. Julia Harper left Andrew's penthouse that night with her world in pieces, but when the sun rose the next morning, she forced herself to breathe through the ache and focus on the tiny heartbeat growing inside her. She had no family nearby, no safety net to fall back on, and very little money saved, yet the shock of his rejection transformed into something she had never felt before, a fierce determination. She told herself that she might not have Andrew's power, wealth, or influence, but she had her strength, and she would use every ounce of it to protect the life she carried. Her tears dried slowly, replaced by long hours of planning, of scraping together whatever resources she could to prepare for the future. She found a small, worn-down apartment on the edge of town, its walls thin and its windows drafty, but it was hers, and it was where she promised herself her child would be safe. The pregnancy was difficult. Without Andrew's support, Julia juggled long hours of work with exhaustion that often left her shaking by the time she returned home. She worked at a diner, taking double shifts, serving tables until her back ached and her feet throbbed, smiling at customers even when all she wanted was to collapse. There were nights when she had to choose between paying rent or buying enough groceries, and more often than not she went to bed hungry so she could save food for the days when the pregnancy drained every bit of energy from her body. Yet no matter how difficult it became, she never regretted her decision to walk away from the man who had told her to forget him. She whispered to her unborn child that they would make it, that love was worth more than money, that family could be built even from broken pieces. When the twins were born, Julia's life changed in ways she had never imagined. The doctor placed two identical baby boys in her arms, both with dark hair and wide brown eyes that mirrored Andrew's so perfectly it nearly broke her heart. She named them Jason and James, and as she whispered their names for the first time, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders with crushing force. 2 mouths to feed, 2 lives to protect, 2 souls depending solely on her. But along with the weight came a love so overwhelming that it eclipsed every fear. She promised them both, as they cried softly in her arms, that they would never feel abandoned, never feel unwanted, and that she would never let them doubt how deeply they were cherished. The following years were both the hardest and the most rewarding of her life. Raising twins alone meant never-ending chaos, sleepless nights filled with cries from 2 cribs at once, days spent balancing bottles and diapers, the constant fear that she wasn't doing enough. Yet even in the exhaustion, there were moments of pure joy. She laughed when they first tried to crawl across the living room floor in opposite directions, cried when they spoke their first words, and held them close when they took their first steps on shaky legs. Every milestone was bittersweet because each reminded her of the man who wasn't there to witness it. Sometimes, when she looked at their faces, so undeniably echoes of Andrew's, anger burned in her chest, but she forced herself to push it aside because she would not allow bitterness to poison the love she poured into her sons. To survive, Julia became resourceful. She sewed clothes for the boys when money ran low, repaired broken toys with glue and tape, and turned even the simplest meals into adventures so her children never felt the absence of luxury. To the outside world, she was a single mother struggling to get by, but to Jason and James, she was everything: provider, teacher, comforter, protector. They clung to her, their small hands gripping hers with trust so complete it made every sacrifice worth it. At night, when exhaustion threatened to consume her, she would watch them sleeping side by side, their identical faces peaceful, and remind herself that though she had been forced to let go of Andrew, she had been given something far more precious in return. Still, the shadow of the past lingered. Julia carried within her the memory of his words, the way his face had hardened, the coldness in his voice when he told her to forget him. She told herself she had succeeded, that she had moved on, but in the quiet hours when the apartment was still and her children were asleep, she sometimes wondered if he ever thought of them. Did Andrew ever imagine what his sons looked like? Did he ever wake in the night with regret gnawing at him the way her memories gnawed at her? She didn't know, and she tried not to care, but the truth was that his absence was a wound she carried silently. She had built her life around strength and survival, but no matter how strong she became, she could not erase the fact that her sons were a daily reminder of both the love she had once felt and the cruelty that had shattered it. 3 years passed in this rhythm of struggle and love, of small victories and hidden scars. Julia no longer expected anything to change. She believed she had created a world where Andrew Collins was nothing but a ghost of her past, a man erased by time and resolve. But what she didn't know was that fate had a way of tearing down the walls we build, and the life she had worked so hard to protect was about to collide with the man she had once sworn to forget. Andrew Collins moved through his days as though nothing in his past lingered behind him, but the truth was that he carried a hollow ache he refused to name. Outwardly, he was a man who had everything. His company dominated markets, his name appeared regularly on the covers of financial magazines, and he was the sort of figure people whispered about when he entered a room. He wore his success like armor, his sharp brown eyes scanning for weakness, his every word weighted with authority. To his colleagues, he was unstoppable, a man who had sacrificed sentiment for strategy and built an empire on discipline alone. Yet when the lights of his office went out at night and the city glowed beneath the glass walls of his penthouse, the silence pressed in too heavily, and he found himself staring at the darkness with thoughts he could not escape. He told himself Julia had been a mistake, a moment of weakness that he had cut out before it could damage his ambitions. He repeated the story so many times he almost believed it. Yet sometimes, without warning, her face appeared in his mind, the softness of her smile, the way her blue eyes had looked at him as though she saw not the ruthless businessman but the man beneath. And worse than the memory of her was the memory of what she had carried when she left. He tried not to think about it, tried to convince himself that she had moved on, that whatever she had done with the pregnancy was no concern of his. But in the quiet hours, doubt crept in. What if she had kept the child? What if somewhere out there was a boy or girl with his eyes, his features, growing up never knowing who he was? He would push the thought aside with work, drowning himself in meetings and strategies, but the unease always returned. The women who now surrounded him were not Julia. They were polished, elegant, and temporary, their interest fixed on his power and wealth. He let them orbit him, but he never let them close, and once the novelty faded he cast them aside without hesitation. They filled nights and banquets but never the emptiness. His friends, if they could be called that, noticed his detachment, but none dared to ask. Andrew lived behind walls so high that no one questioned them, because to the world he was exactly as he wanted to appear, successful, untouchable, and entirely in control. Only he knew that control came at the cost of something he had not allowed himself to admit was missing. Every now and then he would imagine the life he might have had if he had made a different choice. It happened late at night, usually when exhaustion dulled his defenses. He pictured Julia's laughter filling his house, imagined children's footsteps echoing down the hallways of his cold mansion, bringing warmth to rooms that now sat silent. But the visions were fleeting, and he forced himself to bury them, telling himself that such things were not for men like him. He was a builder of empires, not families, and the only legacy that mattered was the one measured in contracts and stock prices. Still, the emptiness gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing year, until even victories felt hollow. 3 years had passed since Julia walked out of his life. 3 years in which he had told himself she had forgotten him, that she had followed his command. But the unease lingered, festering in the corners of his mind. He found himself scanning crowds sometimes, catching glimpses of women with hair like hers or eyes the same shade of blue, only to feel disappointment each time it was not her. It was as if he were searching for something he had convinced himself he didn't want, trapped between his pride and a longing he could not kill. And then one evening, fate finally stripped away his illusions. He walked into a restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, prepared to close a deal worth millions, his mind already rehearsing figures and arguments. The waiter guided him to his table, the chatter of guests filling the air, and as he raised his glass of champagne he caught sight of a woman by the window. At first, his breath stalled because he thought his mind was playing tricks on him again, summoning Julia's face out of longing. But the longer he looked, the more certain he became. It was her. Her hair, now a little lighter, framed her face with a softness that had only grown with time. Her blue eyes still held the same depth that had once disarmed him, though he could see from her posture and the set of her jaw that she was stronger now, more resilient. But what shattered him completely was not Julia herself. Seated beside her were two small boys, identical in every detail, dark brown hair, soft features, and eyes so unmistakably his own that his chest constricted. They were around 3 years old, laughing together, reaching for their mother's hand. The realization struck like a physical blow. He was not looking at strangers. He was looking at his sons. Sons he had never held, never known, sons who had lived their first years without him because of the words he had once thrown at Julia in his arrogance. The deal he had come to discuss, the world he had built, the empire he had fought for, all of it faded into irrelevance in that single instant. Andrew Collins, who had never bowed to anyone, sat frozen in his chair with the weight of truth pressing down on him. He had told her to forget him, and she had. But in forgetting him, she had created a life he had lost the right to be part of, and now he understood for the first time what it meant to have everything and still feel as though you had nothing at all. Andrew's world unraveled in a matter of seconds as he sat in the restaurant, his glass of champagne trembling slightly in his hand. The sound of laughter from the twins carried across the polished floor, slicing through the hum of conversations and the clink of cutlery, reaching him like a melody he had been denied for years. He could not tear his gaze away from them, two little boys who shared his hair, his eyes, and even the same way they tilted their heads when they were curious. His chest tightened with a pressure so heavy it felt like he was suffocating, because there was no longer room for denial. These were his children. The empire he had built, the ruthless choices he had made, the millions he had earned, all of it seemed absurdly meaningless compared to the sight of those two small boys laughing at something their mother whispered. Julia, seated between them, was more beautiful than he remembered, but it was not the kind of beauty that came from youth or charm. It was something forged from struggle and strength, from the resilience of a woman who had faced abandonment and still managed to raise two children with grace. Her blue eyes scanned the room idly until they landed on him, and the moment their gazes collided, the air seemed to shift. She froze, her body tensing, and in her eyes he saw recognition followed by an unmistakable wave of steel. She did not look surprised. She looked prepared, as if she had always known this day might come and had rehearsed how she would face it. Andrew's pulse thundered in his ears as he pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. Every instinct told him to stay seated, to pretend he had not seen her, to cling to the control he had always wielded. But his legs moved of their own accord, carrying him across the dining room. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the past 3 years clung to him, demanding retribution. By the time he reached her table, Julia had already shifted in her seat, her shoulders squared, her body angled protectively toward the children. Her hands rested lightly on the table, but the tension in them betrayed her calm expression. "Julia," he said, his voice low, stripped of its usual authority. For a man accustomed to commanding entire boardrooms, the single word sounded fragile, almost desperate. She looked up at him without blinking. "Andrew," she replied, her tone cool and steady, but beneath it was an edge sharp enough to cut. The boys, oblivious to the tension, glanced curiously at the stranger who had interrupted their meal, one of them grinning wide as though eager to meet someone new. The sight made Andrew's throat tighten, but Julia's gaze pinned him in place, warning him silently not to overstep. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. He wanted to explain, to beg, to tell her that he had thought of her every night, that regret had eaten away at him until there was nothing left but the shell of a man. But the words would not come. All he could do was look at the children, memorizing their faces, their small hands, their identical smiles. The weight of lost years bore down on him, each second reminding him of what he had missed, the first time they walked, their first words, their laughter, their tears. He had traded those moments for his pride, and now he stood in front of the proof of his greatest mistake. Julia's voice broke the silence at last, calm but laced with warning. "What are you doing here?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. She had seen his eyes when they landed on the boys, and she understood the storm that was tearing through him. Still, she would not make this easy for him. He had forfeited the right to be part of their lives the night he told her to forget him, and she was not about to let him simply walk back in as though the years had not happened. Andrew swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally managed to speak. "I didn't know," he said, the words heavy, inadequate, but they were the only ones he could form. Julia's lips pressed together in a line, her jaw tightening as she shook her head slightly. "You didn't want to know," she corrected him, her voice sharp now, edged with the pain of memories she had buried deep. The boys, sensing the change in their mother's tone, leaned closer to her, and Julia reached out to stroke their hair reassuringly. Andrew's chest ached at the gesture, at the casual way she comforted them, at the bond he had no part in building. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless in a way he could not fight with money or influence. This was not a negotiation he could win, not a deal he could close. This was a woman he had broken and children who didn't know he existed. He wanted to fall to his knees, to beg her for a second chance, but he saw in her eyes that it would mean nothing. Julia had grown stronger without him, and she would not allow him to wound her children the way he had wounded her. She rose slowly from her chair, gathering her bag and signaling for the boys to stand. "Come on," she said gently to them, her voice softening in a way that contrasted with the ice she reserved for him. The twins obeyed without question, their tiny hands reaching for hers. She looked at Andrew one last time, her eyes steady, unreadable, and then turned away. As he stood there, watching her walk out of the restaurant with their sons on either side of her, Andrew Collins felt the full weight of his choices settle on him like a prison. He had always believed himself untouchable, a man who could bend the world to his will, but in that moment he understood what it meant to lose something truly irreplaceable. And as the door closed behind them, he realized with searing clarity that for the first time in his life, he wanted something no amount of wealth or power could ever guarantee, a place in the hearts of the family he had once abandoned. Andrew sat back down at his table in the restaurant, but the deal in front of him, the contracts laid neatly across the polished wood, no longer held any meaning. His colleagues spoke, their voices filled with urgency and expectation, but he heard none of it. His thoughts were still at the door through which Julia had just disappeared, her two boys at her side, their small hands gripping hers with a trust and loyalty that should have been his to protect. He realized in that moment that the empire he had built, every skyscraper and boardroom, every article praising his brilliance, was hollow compared to the sound of their laughter. He had traded away what mattered most before he even knew it, and the realization was so sharp that he could barely breathe. That night in his penthouse, the silence was unbearable. The space that had once been his sanctuary now mocked him with its emptiness. He paced the length of the glass windows, his reflection staring back at him like a stranger, and with every step he saw their faces. The twins had his hair, his eyes, even his expressions. He could not erase the way one of them had grinned at him with open curiosity, a grin that had pierced through the walls he had spent a lifetime building. He tried to drink the memories away, pouring himself glass after glass of scotch, but the burn in his throat did nothing to dull the ache in his chest. When he finally sank into bed, sleep refused to come, and he lay awake until dawn with the weight of lost years pressing down on him like chains. The next morning, for the first time in his career, Andrew skipped a meeting. He sat at his desk, staring at the skyline, consumed by thoughts that had nothing to do with mergers or acquisitions. He thought of Julia, of the way her eyes had looked at him with such defiance and protection, of the strength she carried in every movement. He thought of the nights she must have spent alone, cradling two crying infants, while he had been out celebrating another victory. He thought of every doctor's visit, every scraped knee, every moment of joy and fear that he had missed because of his arrogance. The more he let the memories play out in his mind, the more unbearable the silence of his penthouse became, until he found himself gripping the edge of his desk and whispering into the empty room that he had been wrong. Days passed, but he could not let it go. He returned to the restaurant, inventing excuses for business dinners, hoping for another glimpse of her. Sometimes he saw her walking past with the boys, her posture straight, her gaze forward, her hand clutching theirs with unyielding devotion. Each time his chest tightened, and each time he felt the sting of her deliberate avoidance. She never looked at him, never slowed her pace, never gave him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. To her, he was a ghost, and yet to him she was the only thing real. Finally, his resolve broke, and he approached her one evening as she left the restaurant. His voice was unsteady when he called her name, stripped of the power and confidence he wielded so easily in any other setting. Julia turned, her expression calm but sharp, her blue eyes warning him not to come closer. Still, he stepped forward, his heart pounding with a desperation he could not mask. He told her he needed to speak, that he knew he had no right, but that he could not let this go. He said the words he had buried for years, that he had been wrong to send her away, that fear had made him cruel, that he had thrown away the only chance at a family he would ever have. His voice cracked when he said that seeing those boys had torn him apart, because he could see himself in them so clearly and could not bear the thought of living the rest of his life as nothing more than a stranger to them. Julia listened, her face unreadable, her arms crossed as if to shield herself. When he finished, her silence was louder than any accusation. At last, she spoke, her voice even but laced with years of pain. She told him that regret was not enough. Regret did not pay for diapers or formula, regret did not hold two babies through the night when they both cried at once, regret did not stand by her side when she was too tired to move but had no choice. She said he had chosen pride over love, and in doing so, he had abandoned not just her but two lives that had deserved better. Her words struck him harder than any boardroom defeat, because they were the truth he had avoided for years. For a long time, he said nothing, his throat tight, his chest burning. Finally, with his voice hoarse, he admitted that he could never undo what he had done, but he needed, the chance to try. He told her he did not expect forgiveness, not from her and not even from the boys, but he could not stand on the outside any longer. He wanted to prove, in whatever way she allowed, that he was not the same man who had once sent her away. He begged for a chance, one chance, to show that he could be a father, that he could be someone worthy of them. Julia's eyes softened for only a moment, just long enough for him to see that his words had touched something she had buried deep. But then she straightened her shoulders and shook her head, telling him that words meant nothing, that she had heard enough promises in her life to know they were worthless without action. She turned and walked away, her sons on either side of her, leaving him standing alone once again. But this time, the loneliness was different. It was not the emptiness he had once carried without understanding it. It was a sharp, brutal awareness that he had lost something he could not survive without, and unless he found a way to prove himself, he would lose it forever. That night, Andrew sat in his study, staring at a photograph on his desk, a picture of himself shaking hands with a world leader, the kind of image that had once filled him with pride. Now it looked hollow, almost absurd. He realized that if he died tomorrow, his empire would live on without him, but the faces of his sons would never know him. For the first time in his life, he understood that all the power he had amassed meant nothing if he could not hold his children in his arms. And in that moment, he swore to himself that he would do whatever it took to earn back a place in their lives, no matter how long it took or how much of himself it demanded. The days that followed were some of the most difficult Andrew had ever known, because for the first time in his life, success was no longer measured in numbers or contracts but in whether Julia would even allow him near her children. He showed up at the restaurant again, not with the intention of confronting her but simply to wait, to watch from a distance, to gather the courage to try again. At first Julia ignored him completely, her hand wrapped firmly around the twins as she walked past him without so much as a glance. Yet as the weeks went on, she began to notice that he was not approaching recklessly, not making demands, not trying to force his way into their lives. He simply sat quietly at a corner table or stood across the street, a man stripped of pride, waiting for even the smallest opportunity to prove that he was different. It was not Julia who gave him that opportunity but the children themselves. One afternoon as she was gathering their coats, Jason slipped from her grip and wandered toward the man staring at them with such intensity. Julia's breath caught in her throat, but before she could call him back, Jason looked up at Andrew with those same brown eyes and said softly, "You look like me." The innocence in his voice disarmed them both. Andrew knelt down slowly, his movements cautious as though he were approaching a wild creature he didn't want to scare away. His throat tightened as he whispered, "Yes, I do." It was a moment so fragile that Julia almost pulled her son away, but something in Andrew's expression stopped her. For the first time, she saw no arrogance, no calculation, only raw, unguarded humanity. From that day forward, the wall she had built around their lives began to develop cracks. Julia did not forgive, not yet, but she allowed small moments of contact under her careful watch. Andrew accompanied them to the park, where he clumsily tried to keep up with the boys as they darted across the grass, their laughter echoing through the air. He sat on the ground with them to build castles out of blocks, his expensive suit jacket discarded in the dirt as if it meant nothing. At first he was awkward, unsure of how to navigate their endless energy and questions, but gradually he began to learn. He listened to their stories, nodded solemnly when they invented imaginary adventures, and laughed with them when they insisted he play the role of the villain in their games. Julia watched with guarded eyes, waiting for his patience to break, waiting for the man she once knew to resurface. But to her surprise, he kept coming back, even when the boys exhausted him, even when they tested him with childish stubbornness. He returned in simple clothes instead of suits, his sleeves rolled up, his face softened by smiles she had almost forgotten he could give. He seemed determined to show that he was not simply playing a role, but truly learning what it meant to be their father. One evening, when James scraped his knee on the pavement, Julia instinctively rushed forward, but Andrew was already there, kneeling down, wiping away the dirt with a gentleness that left her stunned. He whispered soothing words, held the boy until the tears subsided, and only then did he look up at Julia with an expression so filled with regret and tenderness that it pierced through her defenses. For Andrew, each of these small moments was a revelation. He had built his life on the belief that strength came from control, that emotion weakened a man, but the laughter of his sons made him feel stronger than any victory in the boardroom ever had. Each time one of them reached for his hand, each time they leaned against him without hesitation, he felt the possibility of redemption growing inside him. At night, when he returned to his penthouse, he no longer saw a monument to his power but a prison of his own making. The silence that once felt like peace now suffocated him, because he knew what was missing. He would lie awake, remembering the weight of his son's small hand in his, the sound of their voices calling for him, the way Julia's eyes softened despite her resistance. Julia, however, refused to be swayed too quickly. She reminded herself constantly of the night he had told her to forget him, of the years she had spent alone carrying burdens he should have shared. But as she watched him sitting cross-legged in the grass with their children climbing all over him, or saw him patiently listening as Jason explained an elaborate drawing he had made, she began to feel something she had not allowed herself to feel in years, doubt in her certainty that people could never change. Against her will, she found herself remembering the man she had once fallen in love with, wondering if perhaps he had been buried all this time, waiting for a reason to emerge. The turning point came one late evening when the boys had exhausted themselves playing and had fallen asleep on a park bench, their small bodies curled against each other. Julia started to gather them into her arms, but Andrew stopped her gently and lifted them himself, one in each arm. She expected him to falter under their weight, but instead he carried them with a tenderness that astonished her. As she walked beside him in silence, watching his careful steps, she realized that he looked more complete in that moment than she had ever seen him before. For Andrew, the weight of his sons was not a burden but a gift, and the love he felt for them radiated in every movement. That night, as he laid the boys into their beds and brushed the hair from their foreheads, Julia stood in the doorway, her arms folded but her heart unsteady. She still didn't trust him fully, but she could no longer deny the truth she saw. Andrew was changing, not because he wanted to prove himself to her, but because he wanted to be worthy of his children. And though her wounds were still raw, she felt the first flicker of something she thought she had lost forever, hope that maybe, just maybe, he could become the man she and their sons deserved. Julia had spent years hardening herself against disappointment, teaching her heart never to hope for more than what she could create with her own hands, but Andrew's persistence was beginning to dismantle those defenses in ways she had not anticipated. Every evening he appeared, not with arrogance or demands, but with quiet consistency, the kind that wore down walls brick by brick. She told herself she was allowing him time with the boys only because they deserved to know their father, yet she could not ignore the subtle changes in him. He laughed more easily now, his once cold eyes softening whenever Jason or James reached for him, and she saw in those moments a man who seemed almost unrecognizable from the one who had banished her years ago. The old Andrew had been sharp and unyielding, dismissing vulnerability as weakness, but this version stumbled through bedtime stories, burned pancakes in the kitchen, and allowed 2 3-year-olds to braid his hair with plastic clips until he looked ridiculous, and he did it without shame because their giggles mattered more than his pride. Despite what she saw, Julia fought herself at every turn. She reminded herself of nights when she had been alone, of tears cried into the silence, of the fear she had carried through every step of her pregnancy and the first months of motherhood. She remembered the ache in her body after long days of working double shifts just to keep food on the table, and the exhaustion of waking every hour when both boys cried at once. She remembered all of it with a sharpness that made forgiveness seem impossible. And yet, there were evenings when she caught Andrew watching her with a kind of quiet reverence, his gaze no longer that of a man who thought he owned the world but of someone who was learning what it meant to value what he could have lost forever. In those fleeting seconds, she felt something dangerous stir inside her, something she thought she had buried for good. Andrew, on the other hand, felt each moment with them as though it were both a blessing and a punishment. Every laugh from the twins filled him with joy, but every smile also reminded him of years he had missed. He often lay awake long after leaving Julia's apartment, haunted by the thought that his children's earliest memories would never include him, that the foundation of their lives had been built without his presence. Yet instead of letting that despair consume him, he poured it into determination. He vowed that if he could not change the past, he would devote every part of himself to shaping a future where they would never doubt his love. He accepted Julia's suspicion as deserved, never arguing when she kept her distance, never pushing when she reminded him of the pain he had caused. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was patient, willing to take whatever time was necessary to prove himself. One evening, as twilight fell and the city lights began to shimmer outside Julia's window, the boys curled up on the couch after a long day of play. Jason leaned his head on Andrew's shoulder, his thumb in his mouth, while James clutched a toy car and fought to keep his eyes open. Julia stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed as she watched from the doorway. It should have looked ordinary, 2 children leaning against a man while drifting into sleep, but the sight stole her breath. There was no mistaking the gentleness in Andrew's posture, the way he held himself perfectly still as though afraid to disturb them, the quiet awe in his expression as he looked down at their tiny faces. For Julia, it was both comforting and terrifying, because it showed her a man she could not easily dismiss. Later, when the boys were in bed, the silence between them grew heavy, as it often did. This time, Andrew was the one who broke it. His voice was low, stripped of all the polished authority he used in the boardroom. He confessed that he lived in constant regret, that not a day passed when he didn't think of the moment he told her to forget him. He said that power, success, and money had become meaningless once he realized what he had given up. He admitted he didn't deserve forgiveness, that he couldn't erase the years she had suffered alone, but he begged her not to shut him out completely. He didn't ask for her love, only for the chance to stand beside his children, to be a father even if it was only in fragments. Julia listened without interrupting, her arms folded tightly as if holding herself together. When he finished, her response was calm but sharp enough to wound. She told him that his regret did not heal the nights she had spent in tears or the exhaustion of raising 2 infants without him. She reminded him that regret did not change diapers, did not pay rent, did not hold her hand when fear nearly broke her. Her voice carried no hatred, only truth, and the weight of it pressed down on him until his shoulders sagged. He didn't argue, didn't try to defend himself, only bowed his head and whispered that he knew she was right. For Julia, the moment was unsettling. She had expected excuses, denial, perhaps even anger, but what she found instead was humility. He did not fight her words. He accepted them as punishment he deserved, and something about that acceptance made her falter. She did not forgive him, not then, but she felt the first cracks in her certainty that he could never change. As she turned away, she caught his gaze one last time, and in his eyes she saw not the ruthless man who had once cast her out, but someone broken and rebuilding, someone who had finally understood what mattered. That night, as she lay awake listening to the sound of her children breathing softly in the next room, Julia admitted to herself what she had refused to face for weeks. Andrew was not the same man he had been 3 years ago. He was still guilty, still flawed, still unworthy of easy forgiveness, but he was trying, truly trying, in a way that reached deeper than promises or apologies. And for the first time, she wondered whether her heart, bruised and scarred as it was, could ever allow itself to believe in him again. The weeks that followed unfolded with a rhythm that none of them had expected, but all three began to cling to. Andrew became a steady presence in the lives of his sons, not as a shadow lurking on the edges as before, but as someone who was learning to be there in the everyday moments. He no longer arrived in immaculate suits with the air of a man stepping out of a boardroom. Instead, he came in simple clothes, often with a little mess in his hair from rushing out of the office, his phone tucked away as if he finally understood it no longer mattered. He carried toy cars in his pockets because the boys liked to race them along the table at dinner, and he laughed without restraint when their tiny voices demanded that he be the one to roar like a dragon during their bedtime stories. For a man who once believed control was the source of strength, he discovered that strength could also be found in letting 2 3-year-olds climb across him like a jungle gym, laughing as they did it. Julia watched these changes with a cautious heart. She reminded herself that her trust was not something he had earned simply by showing up, that she had survived too much to hand forgiveness to him easily. Yet each day made it harder to deny that something was different. She saw the way his eyes softened when Jason tugged at his sleeve, the way he crouched down to listen seriously when James described his imaginary world with elaborate detail. She saw the gentleness in his hands when he tied their shoes, the patience in his voice when he explained something for the 10th time without frustration. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, because for the first time she was not just seeing the man who had hurt her but also glimpsing the man she had once fallen in love with, reshaped by regret and the determination to be better. The turning point came on a night when both boys fell ill with a fever. Julia panicked the way she always did when sickness threatened her children, her hands trembling as she rushed between their beds with medicine and cool cloths. For years she had handled these moments alone, relying only on her strength and endurance. But this time, Andrew was there. He stayed with them through the night, holding Jason in his arms while Julia tended to James, whispering comfort into the boy's ear until his sobs quieted. He carried them when they were too weak to move, pressed cool towels against their foreheads, and refused to leave even when exhaustion weighed down on him. Julia, watching him in the dim light of the bedroom, felt something inside her break open, not from pain but from the realization that she was no longer carrying the burden alone. She saw him not as the man who had abandoned her, but as the father who was finally here, giving everything he had without hesitation. When the fever broke and the boys fell into restless but peaceful sleep, Julia and Andrew found themselves in the kitchen, the silence heavy but different from before. He looked worn and pale, but in his eyes there was a raw honesty that startled her. He admitted that the night had shown him more clearly than ever what he had lost, that every cry from their sons reminded him of years he could never get back. He said that he would spend the rest of his life making up for the time he had thrown away, even if he never earned her forgiveness. He told her that success, wealth, power, all of it meant nothing compared to the sight of his children safe in their beds, and he would give it all up if it meant keeping them close. Julia listened, her arms wrapped around herself, the memories of the past still sharp in her mind. But for the first time, she could not deny the sincerity in his words. There was no arrogance in him, no trace of the man who had once told her to forget him. He was not asking to erase the past but to build something new, fragile though it might be. Slowly, almost against her will, she reached out and laid her hand over his. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a gesture that spoke of possibility, of the faintest beginning of trust. His eyes widened, and for a moment she saw something break inside him, the weight of years lifting as hope took root. From then on, life began to change in subtle ways. The twins no longer looked at him as a stranger but as someone who belonged in their world. They called his name without hesitation, tugged at his hands when they wanted to play, and fell asleep on his chest as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Julia noticed how easily he fit into their routines, how he adjusted to their chaos with patience, and how his presence no longer felt like an intrusion but something that had always been meant to be. For herself, she began to notice the way her guard weakened in small increments, how her heart betrayed her when she caught him smiling at their children, or when she felt the warmth of his hand brush against hers as they walked together. One evening, as the city lights glowed outside the apartment windows and the boys slept peacefully in their room, Julia stood beside him in the quiet. He slipped his arm carefully around her shoulders, hesitant as though expecting her to pull away. But this time she didn't. She let herself lean into him, not fully, but enough to let him know that the wall she had built was no longer impenetrable. For Andrew, it was everything. He knew the road ahead would be long, that forgiveness could not be demanded or rushed, but in that moment, with Julia beside him and their son safe in the next room, he felt something he had thought he had destroyed forever, hope for a future that was not broken but whole. Andrew had once told her to forget him, and she had. But now, as he stood with her in the quiet, he vowed that he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never had to again. For the first time, they both allowed themselves to believe that redemption was not only possible, but already beginning to take shape in the fragile, beautiful life they were building together.